Hi, welcome to the second half of Session 12 of History 3380, World Civilizations. In the first half of this session, what we were looking at were the phenomena that seemed to indicate the triumph of the American mission. America's desire to create a global economy and culture that reflected not only its own interests, but many of its own characteristics. In other words, a free market system, an open trade system, a system open to U.S. investment internationally, and a system which reflected such American characteristics as consumerism and individualism. All of this seemed to be coming about, particularly in the economic sphere, in the 1980s and 90s. And not only Latin American countries, but India, even China, began to open themselves up to international trade and investment in ways that they had not done, certainly in recent decades. And furthermore, there was the widespread absorption of American consumerism virtually around the entire globe. And certainly Americans might well think that they had pretty well triumphed in the goals that they had set for themselves in trying to reshape the world in their own image. However, as we already saw, some of this did not involve necessarily a wholehearted embrace of everything American. Many times there were adaptations, transformations of what America was essentially sending to the rest of the world. Something as basic as religion, when we look at Pentecostalism, we see that in many ways it was adapted, nationalized, as it spread in places like Latin America and Africa. And the same could be said of American consumer products, that people may consume them, but they may not do so for quite the same reasons as Americans do. They may not see them as containing quite the same kinds of values that Americans do. In the second half today, we're going to look at some of the challenges to this whole process. In some ways, the United States itself was challenged by this globalized system that was emerging at the end of the 20th century. And beyond that, aside from adapting to or absorbing portions of or transforming aspects of American culture, many people reacted quite negatively to this whole process, both for economic reasons, feeling that they were in fact suffering from this process of globalization, and at other times, as we'll see in looking especially at the Middle East, because of clashes over values, over the way America envisioned the world and the way other people envisioned the world were often at odds. And so we'll see both of these kinds of reactions and also some of the problems the Americans encountered. When we look at the first slide, what I'm talking about there in terms of struggling to maintain a global market is that the United States itself would find itself seriously challenged economically by the closing decades of the 20th century, really from the mid-1970s on. The United States had to face increasing competition from some of the same countries it helped resurrect after World War II, such as Japan and Germany, but a larger force in the form of the European Union. And of course, the emergence of China as a significant economic force late in the 20th century. But it also had to be concerned, as we will see, in trying to keep an open global market. In regards to this first challenge of competing with countries that were now vying to become the leading economic power, the United States underwent a significant transformation away from some of the policies adopted during the New Deal, that time when the Democratic Party and high-tech corporations and big labor had crafted this sort of alliance to permit, on the one hand, an aggressive international investment strategy by corporations, while at the same time guaranteeing certain benefits to American workers. That was coming to an end. The end of the social pact that essentially was forged at this time included tax cuts for corporations and for the well-to-do, and also an end of certain benefits that had been routinely enjoyed, especially by unionized workers, and in particular that included cost of living adjustments. What this meant in particular was this. First, whether companies were high-tech, low-tech, all of them found an increasingly challenging competitive international economy facing them in the closing decades of the 20th century. So the federal government started passing out tax cuts, reducing taxes on corporations as a way of trying to give them a competitive edge in the international market. But in addition, the government also sought to lower the wage increases that workers were gaining, again, so that companies could compete more effectively in a world where more and more corporations from other parts of the world had access to even cheaper labor than what might be available in the United States. So in many cases, unions found that they could no longer get cost of living adjustments in the agreements, the contracts they signed with corporations. In other words, agreements that would raise wages each year depending on how significant inflation was, aside from any other increases that they might get. These kinds of automatic cost of living adjustments were eliminated, and the Reagan administration took a very hard line with unions when they went on strike in the United States. So the idea was to try to cheapen the cost of doing business for American companies that now faced strong international competition. At the same time, the United States was pressuring other countries to try to avoid the creation of regional trading agreements that would exclude the U.S. These concerns were focused on places like Europe, where the European Union had been formed, and also in Asia, where trade agreements were being signed. The fear of the United States was that it would be locked out from many important parts of the world economy if regional trade agreements gave special treatment to, let us say, countries in Asia or countries in Europe. So the United States actually pressures to try to avoid those agreements excluding the United States or other countries from trade in a particular region. Another aspect of American policy, and a significant challenge that it faced, even as the world seemed to be accepting of its larger strategies, was the issue of oil. The United States had built its own economic power for the past 100 years on cheap hydrocarbons. Americans, more than probably any other country in the world, were very used to having access to large amounts of cheap fuel. And that was important not only to industry, but also to consumers, because, of course, the United States had become the land of the automobile. The concern of the United States was any possible threat to the supply of oil in the world, especially, of course, in the Middle East, where so much of that oil was being produced. Even though most of the Middle East oil didn't flow to the United States, that was really irrelevant. The concern was if oil from the Middle East were reduced in amount, that would send the world price of oil skyrocketing, something we've seen a few times here in the last few decades. That means the United States, of course, would suffer as fuel prices went up because it was so heavily dependent on cheap fuel. Two wars in the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century were aimed at preventing a serious interruption in the oil supply. The first Gulf War in 1990 was pretty straightforward in its aim. Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, had invaded Kuwait, his neighbor, seized its oil. And there were real fears that Iraq might go on expanding, even attacking Saudi Arabia, the leading oil producer. And so the United States responded, along with other international forces, to drive back the Iraqi army and eventually force it back into Iraq and deliver a major defeat. The main purpose of this, of course, was to ensure that no country was going to dominate the oil exports of the Middle East that might be hostile to the United States and its allies. The second war, the all-out invasion of Iraq that began in 2003, had a somewhat more subtle way, even though invasion doesn't seem very subtle, but its goal was somewhat more subtle in the way it tried to achieve it. Again, the goal is to secure the access to oil in the Middle East for the United States and other Western powers. However, in this case, what the Americans hoped to achieve was to reshape Iraq, to make it, just as they envisioned Cuba 100 years before, a sort of model built on the United States in terms of having representative government, an open free market economy, a competitive economic system, a system that would be open to ideas from the West. All of this, and of course a rebuilding of the infrastructure, just as the United States had done in Cuba 100 years before, all of this designed to create a stable Middle Eastern power that could spread its influence to the rest of the region, help stabilize the region, and thereby ensure a steady flow of oil. Why Iraq in particular? Well, Iran was out of the question because the government there was extremely hostile to the United States, for reasons we'll see in a few minutes. The two main possibilities in the Middle East were Iraq and Iran. Why? Because each of them had a lot of people and a lot of oil money. So each of them were potential dominant forces in the region. Iraq became the ideal possibility given the hostilities between Saddam Hussein and the United States and the relative fragility of the Saddam Hussein regime. So the invasion there was meant, among other purposes, to create a society, a political system, an economy that would be modeled as much as possible after that of the United States and become a stabilizing influence in the region to help continue to ensure the flow of oil. But as we've seen in the last few years, since that invasion occurred, this was by no means a simple task. Not only for a variety of military reasons, etc., but because there were stark contrasts between the culture of the United States and the culture of this Islamic society. The countries that the United States had tried to transform at the beginning of the 20th century, like Cuba, were much closer to the United States in terms of cultural values and traditions. Islamic countries were very different. And as we will see, that kind of cultural clash became a major complicating problem. But the immediate difficulty was the inability to stabilize Iraq and to begin to ensure a stable and steady flow of oil from the Middle East. As the United States was involving itself in international strategic issues, trying to maintain a flow of oil, it was also pursuing its own economic agenda. As much as it was opposed to other nations forming regional trading blocs, it was actually busy doing that itself at home with the creation of NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. The North American Free Trade Agreement, as its name suggests, is meant to bring free trade to North America, meaning Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So the North American Free Trade Agreement was designed to bring down trading barriers between these three countries to, in essence, advance the process of globalization within North America itself. But although the governments of the three countries embraced this idea, it didn't necessarily mean that people in these countries, especially Mexico, were equally receptive to this rapid process of globalization that would take place under NAFTA. One of the places where major issues arose was in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas. Chiapas was a site not only of peasant agricultural production, but it also had gone through a significant commercialization of its agricultural system, large-scale cattle farming, which had displaced many peasants. And it had also gone through a mobilization of a portion of the population to work in the oil industry. Particularly affecting the peasant population in Chiapas was the decision by the Mexican government to change Article 27 of its Constitution in 1992. The significance of Article 27 of the Constitution was that it basically protected peasant landholdings. It essentially protected the communal nature of peasant lands and essentially prevented lands held by peasant communities from being sold off, from being commercialized. That protection ended when Article 27 of the Constitution was essentially revised in 1992, suddenly accelerating the process of land takeovers by large investors. In 1994, a group of masked armed men came down out of the hills of Chiapas and seized several important towns in the state. They announced themselves to be Zapatistas, taking their name from the Mexican revolutionary hero Zapata. And they were there, as they would soon make clear, to challenge NAFTA and to challenge the whole process of globalization. Their spokesman was a man named Commandante Marcos. And Commandante Marcos's quote here clearly states what the agenda of the Zapatistas is. As he says, this isn't about Chiapas, it's about NAFTA and Mexican President Carlos Salinas' whole neoliberal project. So the Zapatistas, this guerrilla group, sprang out of deep-seated discontent among the rural population with commercialization of agriculture that was denying them land, with the opening up of freer trade between the United States and Mexico, which meant many Mexican peasants who produced corn found themselves being undersold by cheaper American corn. The Zapatistas at the same time were not the same kind of armed guerrilla that had led rebellions and revolutions in the past. They were not Fidel Castro of the 21st century. Instead, the Zapatistas tried to organize people. They used the international media to draw attention to their cause. Specifically, the very day that they came out of the hills to seize towns in Chiapas was the same day that the NAFTA agreement went into effect in 1994. So their plan was to, yes, be armed to protect themselves, but to focus on political and social mobilization. And their agenda was very much anti-globalization, anti-neoliberal, feeling that peasants, the rural population of Mexico, would suffer in this process as large investors came and took over the land, and as prices for corn dropped precipitously in Mexico, that it was the peasant population that would suffer severely in this process. This was just one example of what became a mounting movement that is generally simply called anti-globalization. Further evidence of such opposition to globalization came as the United States tried to expand NAFTA into what it called the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas. The Free Trade Agreement of the Americas was pretty much like the North American Free Trade Agreement. The Free Trade Agreement of the Americas would encompass all of North and South America. Not just Mexico, but Central America, South America. All these countries would become involved in a regional trading bloc, lower their tariffs, open themselves up to more foreign investment. But that agreement has never been signed and is unlikely to be signed any time in the foreseeable future. That's because a series of leaders have come to power in Latin American countries who are at best suspicious, if not overtly hostile, to the principles of globalization. One of them was a former labor leader in Brazil, a man named Lula. Another, a former military officer, Hugo Chavez, who became president of Venezuela in 1998. and who immediately began a set of policies challenging the United States, calling for higher oil prices, denouncing globalization. Yet another was Evo Morales, the first Native American, the first indigenous citizen of Bolivia ever to be elected president in 2006. And one of the first things that Evo Morales did was to nationalize the gas industry. The natural gas industry in Bolivia had been privatized during this era of globalization, and Evo Morales turned around and reversed that very policy. These challenges to the free trade agreement that the United States was proposing by Lula, the challenges to U.S. policies by Chavez, the nationalization of the gas industry, were all part of a mounting anti-globalization process that was going on as people challenged the system, arguing that in fact poverty had grown in Latin America even as globalization was spreading, and that what globalization was really doing was giving vast advantages in trade and investment to foreigners, especially Americans. That kind of discontent was prevalent throughout the region. In Guatemala, coffee workers work 12-hour days, earning $2 a day, not enough to buy even a half of a small Starbucks coffee, the product that they help grow. Again, reasons for discontent were pretty straightforward. People felt that they remained or were becoming increasingly impoverished in the face of the process of globalization. Argentina, on the other hand, had been a poster child for the process of globalization. Argentina had embraced this process, had fixed its exchange rates, basing them on the dollar, meaning ensuring the stability of their currency. This had made it possible for Argentinians to buy a whole array of foreign consumer goods, because now, if the Argentinian peso is strong, they can go out and buy imported goods from the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. The problem was that this system also made Argentinian exports increasingly expensive and was accompanied by acute corruption in the Argentinian government. By 2001, Argentina was experiencing a debt crisis. Its exports were falling, its economy was slowing to a crawl. It was unable to pay its international debts. It defaulted on that debt. In other words, was unable to make a payment. At this point, the government and the entire neoliberal experiment, the entire idea of opening the economy up to foreign trade and investment, collapsed, as did the government itself. In fact, there were a succession of presidents in Argentina after this crisis. So we see throughout this region, which was really the first to embrace ideas of neoliberalism, to open itself up fully to trade and investment from foreign countries, especially the United States, a series of developments that lead people to deeply resent the process of globalization and to react strongly against it, to elect leaders who challenge the system. In Peru in 2002, there were popular protests, people objecting to government plans to sell off oil fields and other natural resources and state-owned enterprises. Those mobilizations, those political mobilizations, led to the cancellation of these plans to sell off national assets. So time and time again, throughout the region, we see these vehement reactions against this process. These kinds of protests are fairly straightforward and understandable in terms of many groups in these countries found their standard of living declining, particularly rural populations, but also populations in urban centers, as they found themselves without protected industries, as they found themselves having to compete in international markets that demanded lower wages before companies would invest in countries, loss of land by rural populations. All of these contributed to this growing dissent. And it's, again, very understandable that people would react, would become suspicious of globalization, and even demand a reversal of some of the neoliberal policies that were a part of it. But there were also other complex reactions which were not strictly linked just to economic issues, although they do have an economic element to them. Perhaps the most dramatic, and the reason I use the illustration because it is most dramatic, but we can find similar kinds of cultural reactions in much of the world to American influence. Protests about American consumerism, protests about types of American companies, assertions, once again, of nationalism that are very much like the nationalist assertions of the 1930s and 40s. But in Islam, we see a very strong cultural reaction that's relatively easy to trace. The basic conflict has to do with the conception of an Islamic society. The idea that an Islamic society is a society which is thoroughly Islamic. Unlike Western societies where, yes, there's a place for religion, but religion is not assumed to have power over political decision-making, the making of laws, the educational process. In a truly Islamic society, Islam would have all of those influences, particularly the influence of Islamic law, or Sharia. Instead of simply having civil courts, you would have courts that draw upon Islamic law for the basis of their decisions. The educational process, the political process, all of them would be influenced by the values of Islam. Now, within the Middle East, these ideas have taken on, at times, a political form. In other words, they have become the inspiration of political movements. The idea that Islam should be dominant throughout these societies. One such movement erupted in the Arabian Peninsula back in the 18th century, known as Wahhabism. The Wahhabis, who were then ruled by the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans controlled the Arabian Peninsula, denounced the Ottoman Sultan for corrupting Islam, for allowing foreigners, Westerners, to intrude, for allowing foreign cultural influences to spread, for not rigorously enforcing Islamic law. And they rebelled against the Ottomans. They were eventually crushed, but Wahhabism remained an important line of political thought throughout important areas in the Middle East, especially the Arabian Peninsula. At the same time, there is another influence helping to generate interest in political Islam. And that is the intrusions by the West. At the end of the 18th century, Napoleon Bonaparte of France invaded Egypt when it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. and he defeated the local Ottoman forces. And although his time in Egypt would be relatively brief, it sent a powerful message about the ability of the West to impose itself in the Middle East. And of course was followed in subsequent decades by the rise of French and then British imperialism as the French and the British came to dominate Egypt. So there is continuing challenge to these Islamic societies from the West, not only in the form of ideas about secularism, but by the imposition of Western power on parts of the region. By the middle of the 20th century, what were now a series of independent states were characterized by two political types. States that were nationalistic, Egypt would be an example of that, and states that were monarchies, such as Saudi Arabia. So virtually every Middle Eastern country could be defined as either a monarchy or a nationalist republic. But those states, whether they were monarchies or nationalist republics, had consistently failed to achieve economic development, had cut off open political debate. Increasingly, after the middle of the 20th century, people in the region were increasingly discontented with the options that they had, whether it was a monarchical state or a nationalist republic. Out of that situation, political Islam came to have growing influence, people turning to Islamic political parties as a third alternative, not only to poverty, to a lack of democracy, a lack of representation, but also to the increasing influence in their societies of the West. Western oil companies, Western culture in the form of radio, television, movies. So political Islam begins to gain growing acceptance in the second half of the 20th century. The place where political Islam would first achieve success was in the nation of Iran. Iran, although not an Arab state, it is rather the remains of the ancient state of Persia and subsequent monarchical states. But Iran is a thoroughly Islamic country, one of the few in the region that has a majority Shiite population. It was ruled, as of the middle of the 20th century, by Shah Mohammed Reza Pahlavi, an autocrat who was seeking to modernize his country, using its considerable oil revenues to achieve that goal. So here we have one of the two political types that I just talked about, that of the monarchical system in Iran. However, the monarchy faced challenges from nationalist movements in the country, particularly from this political figure, Mohammed Mossadegh, one of the most prominent of the nationalist spokespersons. Mossadegh rose to become the prime minister of Iran, and in that position, he authorized the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry, an oil industry controlled at that time by the British. Seeing a threat to the steady flow of oil from the Middle East, the United States authorized an intervention by the CIA in 1953 to overthrow Mossadegh, an intervention which led to a military coup, which did in fact topple Mossadegh from power that year. So here again, historically, the United States was looking to maintain access, and in doing so, involving itself in a conflict between a monarchical form of government and a rising nationalist movement. Its concern not with whether it was a monarchy or a nationalist movement, but with the fact that the oil industry was nationalized, and it feared that would damage the flow of oil from the Middle East. Back in power as a result of the United States, the Shah redoubled his efforts to achieve modernization. Much like other autocrats we've seen, much like the Tsarist regime in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, the Shah tried to rapidly modernize. First of all, by opening up his country to more foreign investment, this time in the form of multiple U.S. oil companies coming in and taking over where the British had left off. In addition, allowing foreign companies to come in and commercialize agriculture, to rapidly develop agricultural exports, and to encourage foreign investment in a variety of other sectors of the economy. One of the results of all of this was a rapid migration of people out of the countryside into the cities. As agriculture becomes commercialized, as large producers, foreign and domestic, take over, more and more peasants lacking land flee to the cities hoping to find work. This attempt to rapidly modernize, much as we saw in Russia, set off a series of conflicts. First of all, the development of Western department stores challenged the business interests of the merchant class, known as Bazzaries, in Iran. They saw their traditional marketplaces being threatened by these modern retail enterprises. But aside from peasants losing land and merchants losing business, there were other fundamental issues. The growing influence of the West, especially the United States, through the media, movies and television, that, of course, presented America's very secular society, presented American views of gender relations and sexuality in very explicit forms. Meanwhile, the Shah mimicked some of those values, requiring coeducation at universities, where it had been previously banned, and also setting up schools of theology at universities. Now, you might assume that, well, gee, that sounds pretty pro-religion if you're setting up schools of theology at state universities. But in fact, what the Shah intended was to undermine the traditional clergy, the ulema, who had controlled the education of young clergymen in their own schools. Now, that monopoly on religious education was being threatened by these schools of theology. So rather than being seen as supportive of Islam, the clergy saw this as a threat to their position. The leading religious figure, the Ayatollah Khomeini, had long been a sharp critic of the Shah of Iran. And he had been forced into exile as a result of his criticism of the regime. But he had gone on spreading dissent to his followers in Iran as the Shah continued to promote his strategy of modernization and even westernization. So we have a society, an Islamic society, trying under the leadership of a monarch to rapidly modernize and at the same time making considerable concessions to the influence of Western culture. All the while creating not only dissent over the influence of the West, but also antagonizing various elements of society, including peasants and merchants, because of the economic losses that they suffer due to this process of modernization. The growing unrest was particularly centered in the urban areas, where hundreds of thousands of peasants had been migrating over the decades, only to find minimal employment, often as street vendors. These recent migrants from the rural areas were strongly influenced by the Ayatollah and by his message that the Shah was in fact conducting a war on Islam. Increasing protests swept through Iran in the late 1970s. By the end of 1978, the Shah's position was untenable because his own generals were afraid to send troops out to put down the demonstrations, because the clergy had told enlisted men in the military not to fire on their fellow citizens. So the Shah and his generals weren't even certain they could rely on their own army to keep the protesters down. Finally, the Shah fled the country and launched what would soon become the Islamic Revolution. Initially, the groups that we would describe essentially as nationalists came to power, but their hold on power was fragile, and very quickly, the Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran, and very soon an Islamic Republic was declared. The first successful movement of political Islam had come to fruition in Iran. And the issues that brought political Islam to power involved both the kinds of economic issues we've seen with globalization in Latin America, but also serious conflict over what degree of influence from the West would be permissible in an Islamic society. So we have both economic and cultural issues here at stake. The new government in Iran would have a traditional republican structure. In other words, there is a legislature, a chief executive, a court system. But at the top of that, and of course elections are held to select the legislature, to select the chief executive. But above all of that stands the Ayatollah, the principal religious leader the Ayatollah Khomeini and then his successor, as the decisive force in the system. Along with the Ayatollah, there is also a council of guardians who oversee the actions of the Republican government. Essentially, what this means is that no legislation can be approved and enacted without the approval of the Council of Guardians. This is to ensure that legislation will reflect Islamic law and what the clergymen who make up the Council of Guardians believe to be the basic principles of an Islamic society. So we have a representative government that looks much like governments in the West, but we also have an overseer, the leading religious figure in the country, and the Council of Guardians that ensure that there will be the enforcement of Islamic law and what they feel are the values of an Islamic state. This means, for example, segregation of the sexes. For a long time after 1979, the idea of young men and women congregating together was strictly prohibited. There has been some relaxation of that in recent years. But still, there are dress codes for women which are enforced up to a certain point, not to the same extent as you might see in other Islamic societies, but still dress codes that affect women in particular. There is also a strict enforcement of Islamic law. In addition to trying to establish the principles of an Islamic society, the state has also sought to limit or exclude Western culture. One of the most striking examples was the prohibition imposed on satellite televisions. You could no longer have a satellite television, because that would allow you, of course, to access television from really almost anywhere in the world. So if you're caught with one of these on your roof, you would have it confiscated and you would be seriously fined. The internet is also monitored and controlled in terms of what people can access. So the idea of putting up specific barriers to foreign and, quite frankly, Western and especially American influences. Because, of course, if you look at global television, well, there are all kinds of materials coming from various parts of the world. The material that is most pervasive in its presence around the globe is, of course, American television. It may not represent the majority of programming in any given national network around the world, but it's always a significant portion and usually draws significant attention. That was going to be controlled in this Islamic society. Now, at the same time, this is an Islamic society that wants to modernize and advance. If you want to import technical books on computer science, chemistry, etc., sure. It's just that other types of literature would not so readily be imported into the country. What we have then is the first clear example of political Islam. And it's important to see it for the purposes that we are examining it in the context of globalization. Yes, there are important economic issues in Iran. One of the things, of course, that the Iranian Republic did, the new Islamic Republic, was to nationalize the oil industry, to take it out of the hands of American corporations. And that had long been a critical issue. It was an issue back at the time of Mossadegh, 1953, of foreign control of oil. And that remains an issue in many Islamic societies where there are substantial oil resources. But aside from that basic economic issue, that issue of economic nationalism that we've seen in many parts of the world, we also have another aspect of the globalization process and reactions to it that's far more complex and far less well understood in terms of cultural clashes, that people do not necessarily and universally embrace all the values and the ideas of the West, of American society and American values. Well, we consider secularism, individualism to be critical elements in human societies, values that we think should be universally accepted. That doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the world agrees. Political Islam demonstrates one of the striking contrasts where we see people rejecting not only the economic trends that may emanate from globalization, but also cultural influences that are very much part of this same process. We talked early in the course about the fact that trade is never just trade. It comes with ideas. And that reality very much applies to globalization. When we talk about globalization, even on an economic level, we're talking about a process, of course, that's much more complicated than the trade routes that the Mongols helped defend, the spice trade that the Portuguese and the Dutch wanted to control. Here we have not only trade in goods, we have trade on a monumental scale that affects virtually every human being in the world. And not only trade, but also investment. Vast movements of capital and technology that increasingly penetrate the far corners of the earth. But along with that, inevitably come a set of ideas. If you're going to embrace modern industry, for example, as we've seen, you have to have at least a reasonably educated population in order to function as workers and staff people in modern industry. If you're going to engage in the high-tech end of a modern economy, computers, the internet, then you need a very large and highly trained, highly educated and skilled population. Much of this system relies on, of course, certain values regarding mass and education, regarding individual ambition, regarding rapid exchanges of information. Can you run a modern company today if you don't have access to the internet? Virtually impossible. You have to be able to keep up with those rapid changes. All of this implies certain values, a certain openness and flow of ideas across the globe, a certain acceptance about competitiveness and capitalist operations and bureaucratization of economic activity. Remember all the things that Mao was against in China. So what we see in Iran is that indeed these are people grappling with both of these aspects of globalization. In some places, like Latin America, most of the emphasis is on the economic issue and whether globalization disadvantages large parts of the population and perhaps even impoverishes large parts of the population. But in Islamic societies, it's not just an issue of the relative benefits versus the negatives of economic globalization, but the fact that it implies exposure to a vast array of ideas that may conflict. I'm not saying that they're nothing but universal conflicts, because that isn't true. But some of these ideas and values may conflict with the values of an Islamic society. So we see one stark example of societies that have rejected certain aspects of this process of globalization, not only on the economic level, but on the cultural level as well. And as we were about to see with this next slide, that some of this has led to open and violent conflict. Americans, of course, are extraordinarily sensitive to the events that occurred in this country on 9/11. And we have to realize that part of this represents the conflicts and struggles that have grown out of globalization. The immediate past in terms of 9/11 can be traced to events in Afghanistan between 1979 and 1989. In 1979, the Soviet Union sent troops to Afghanistan. Why? Because a pro-Soviet government in Afghanistan was being challenged by Islamic rebels. The Soviets were fearful that such militancy among an Islamic population would spread into the many Islamic republics that were part of the Soviet Union itself. So it was acting to try to defend its internal stability. The United States, on the other hand, saw the movement of Soviet troops in Afghanistan as a step taken by the Soviets to put them that much closer to the strategic oil reserves of the Middle East. Feeling threatened by that possibility, the United States and Saudi Arabia worked actively to support the Islamic guerrillas against the Soviets. Including the recruitment of what were called Afghan Arabs. Young men from Arab countries, like Jordan, Syria, recruited to fight on the side of the Afghan rebels. Among the people who assisted in this process was Osama bin Laden, a Saudi citizen from the region in the Arabian Peninsula that had been the home of the Wahhabist rebellion of the 18th century and remained a hotbed of Wahhabist political thought right into the 20th century. So Osama bin Laden was a product of political Islam traced all the way back to its roots in the 18th century. The form of political Islam that Osama bin Laden promoted was the most extreme version that called for the purging of Middle Eastern states of their existing political systems From this perspective, both the monarchies and the nationalist republics in the Middle East had all betrayed Islam, had all permitted massive penetration of Western culture, Western values, and of course allowed the West to dominate the oil reserves of the region. So those states would have to be eliminated in order to create true Islamic states. And of course, it would also mean driving Western influence from the region as well. And to achieve this, Osama bin Laden and others were willing to turn to acts of terrorism. What we find here is the volatile mix that can be created by the process of globalization. Now, globalization has permitted vast increases in the generation of wealth. It has linked people through ideas and trade in scope and rapidity that simply could never have been matched in past centuries. But at the same time, as we've seen by looking at Latin America and looking at the Middle East, this process can also be highly disruptive of existing social, economic, and cultural formations. Much as early in the course, when we talked about the pre-modern world and what it looked like, with its peasant economies, its social organizations based on kin groups and clientelage, and all of that swept away with the rise of the trading republics, of the trading empires, and then the rise of capitalism. That process was massively disruptive as well. We've seen what happened in Africa or in Asia with the fall of empires, revolution. Globalization, potentially, is having the same kind of massive effect, and sometimes disruptive and violent, in the 21st century. As much as it holds promise of phenomenal economic production, it also is causing drastic reshapings of peasant societies, of nationalistically based economic models from the past, challenging strongly held cultural values and views. And all of this can become a powerful, volatile mix, which may not only be expressed in mass mobilizations against globalization, may not only be expressed in revolutionary upheavals like the Iranian Revolution, but also may take the form of violent expression, such as the rise of Osama bin Laden and the extremist groups within political Islam. That leads to an interesting question about where we stand at the beginning of the 21st century. Many people argue that, of course, we've already created a global economy, which is certainly true to a considerable extent. But are we also creating a global culture? There are fears expressed that what we are in the process of doing is creating a homogenized global culture, that the whole world will someday look like, you know, a mall from the United States. I suspect from the examples I've shown you, whether it's things like Pentecostalism or reinterpretations of what Coca-Cola means or political Islam, that in fact what we're going to see are a series of distinctive cultures, but ones that have been highly influenced by the process of globalization. And although these various cultures may share common material features, already today you can travel to major cities in the world, and if it weren't for signs in foreign languages, there are significant segments of large urban complexes around the globe that all look very much alike. Just as in the United States, you could easily be put into a mall, whether in St. Louis or New York or San Francisco or Austin, and you really wouldn't know where you were on first sight because they all look alike. Well, some of that commonality of material culture is spreading around the globe. You can go to cities like Caracas, Venezuela, and a lot of it looks like a modern American city with malls and superhighways, etc. But while that's true, it doesn't necessarily mean at the same time that cultures are going to take on the same kind of uniformity. The fear of cultural homogeneity, that we'll all be sharing the same basic consumer culture, is partly based on a myth about cultural authenticity. We often look at the world and talk about, well, boy, things have really changed. It didn't used to be like this. This isn't really what America is about, or this is not what my culture or society used to be like. As if a culture were some kind of permanent, rigid formation. Talk about, well, America's not the way it used to be. It's not hardworking like it used to be. Whatever. Kids don't respect their parents anymore. When did they ever? Cultures are not concrete and unchangeable. They're always changing. They're always being influenced. Whether it's the Dakota Indians, adopting firearms, and then you say, oh, well, those are Plains Indians. Yeah, but how long have they been Plains Indians? About 100 years. And all cultures, although they may not go through quite as dramatic and drastic a set of transformations as the Dakota Indians did, all cultures are constantly absorbing and adopting from other societies. Only rarely is a community or a society so isolated that it receives little, if any, influence from other human organizations. Now, certainly this interchange and exchange of values and beliefs is accelerating as the exchange of goods and ideas accelerates in the process of globalization. People are constantly making choices, as we've seen, sometimes rejecting what they see as constituting a global culture that they don't want, a very Americanized global culture, at least at this point. Sometimes modifying it, but constantly, to some degree, integrating into their own values and beliefs ideas from other cultures and other societies. So human cultures have never been static. If there's anything that you can take from this course is how drastically human societies have changed over the course of even just 500 years, never mind 1,000 or 2,000. And that pace of change may well be accelerating as we're able to communicate with each other so much more rapidly and on such grand scales with the mass media. But there's nothing unique in the fact that people are constantly incorporating and adapting ideas from other societies. So, in some ways, the more things change, the more they remain the same. The pace of change may have rapidly accelerated, especially in the last 50 or 70 years. And certainly since the coming of the Industrial Revolution. But not all of that is unique. It's simply a speeded up version of adaptation and change that's been going on throughout human history. Another constant is that the creation of large systems, whether ancient empires, trading empires in the early modern world, the colonial empires of Europe, or, if you want, a globalized empire marked by the spread of American values. Inevitably, these types of systems, these massive economic, political systems, create inequalities between rich and poor. And we're seeing that happen today, and we're seeing the reactions to that in anti-globalization movements that question the economic model. At the same time, as I suggested, this is a new kind of empire, if you want to call it that. The irresistible empire that I talked about before. That as much as the United States has exercised military force, especially in the second half of the 20th century and beginning of the 21st, nevertheless, its greatest influence, historically, will be the influence of its ideas and values, not the least of which, of course, is consumerism. That is why the past 100 years has so often been termed the American century. Not so much because America emerged as a global military power, which it certainly is, and the dominant one at this stage, but because of the pervasive influence of American economic institutions and American cultural values that have spread on a truly global scale in recent decades. And of course, there is the possibility that what we are seeing now are the very early beginnings of perhaps a Chinese century, when China assumes leadership of the economic world. But if that's true, it's unlikely that China will have the same kind of influence that the United States has had. The Chinese certainly do not appear to be on the sort of transformational mission that Americans set themselves on several centuries ago, spreading their values, their beliefs. The Chinese are much more interested, it would appear, as were the British before them, in simply creating an economic empire, rather than trying to truly transform the societies which they encounter. And finally, as we try to sort of look towards the future, there may be another force, even more powerful than the United States or China. When we talked about the transition from the pre-modern to the early modern to the modern world, a critical moment came when the Earth's climate began to change, when it warmed for several centuries and then cooled, setting off mass migrations and invasions by nomadic peoples, setting the stage for the spread of the Black Death, which in turn triggered massive changes in the world, politically, economically, socially. Now, we appear to have entered yet another era of rapid climate change, driven certainly to a considerable degree by human beings. Well, it's unlikely that we're going to see another rapid cooling anytime in foreseeable centuries. The warming process itself endangers millions of people, especially in developing countries, and especially those who live near seashores and those who live in arid and semi-arid regions. That warming, the rise of the sea, shortages of rain, could create migrations of human beings unimagined at any time in the world's history. potentially of tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people, which in turn could set off processes of change that none of us can possibly foresee, and that could radically change the idea that there will be simply a progression from American economic dominance to Chinese economic dominance within a stable world system. So perhaps humankind does not have quite the control over its own history that it believes.